Okay, hello, and welcome to the latest webinar from the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. It's brought to you by the ABA Rights of Women Committee and co-hosted by Equal Pay Today and the Equal Rights Advocates. We're joined by my three fellow panelists today, Maya Raghu, who is the Director of Workplace Justice at Director of Workplace Equality at National Women's Law Center, Sue Hom Walker, who is the Vice President and Associate General Counsel for Global Labor and Employment at Salesforce, and Sungyan Choi Maro, who is Executive Director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, also known as Napa. So we're very excited to have you all here today for our webinar entitled Inside the Asian American Pacific Islander Women's Pay Gap, Legislative Approaches and Proactive Measures of Employers. During today's program, you can ask questions of our panelists by finding the questions drop box on the right-hand side panel and typing in your questions. And at the end, we're going to have time to go over as many questions as there is time to do, and we'll select the questions and then answer them during that Q&A period. Also on the panel to your right is a handouts drop-down where you can access our written materials as well as the PowerPoint presentation. And finally, we'll be sharing a recording of this program along with any of the handouts and the PowerPoint to everyone who registered. So you can feel free to access those materials after and share them widely with your networks. So we are thrilled today to begin our panel. And as I mentioned, the panel is on the Asian American Pacific Islander Women's Pay Gap. As many of you know, we recognize Equal Pay Days throughout the year. And what an Equal Pay Day is it's a day that we recognize where women have to work to earn what men earned in the prior year. So the first Equal Pay Day of the year is AAPI, Women's Equal Pay Day, and it is tomorrow, March 5th, 2019. So what that means is that women, Asian American women, overall must work until March 5th, 2019 to earn what white non-Hispanic men earned in 2018. And the reason we, of course, recognize these Equal Pay Days is to show the real-world effect of what these wage gaps really do, and the real-world effect not only on women, but also on the families that they support with their wages. So we've covered that. So I wanted to just give a quick overview of the broader wage gap numbers that we're aware of. And just so everyone knows, these wage gap numbers are based on U.S. Census Bureau data, and actually the National Women's Law Center, where one of our panelists, Maya Raghu, works, has a lot of helpful breakdowns of wage gap data on their website for further analysis and fact sheets. So I wanted to just give you a sense of the overall picture of the wage gaps before we get started. So for Asian women overall, the wage gap is 85 cents to the dollar, meaning that Asian women overall earn just 85 cents to every dollar earned by white non-Hispanic men. Now that's for Asian women overall, and you're going to hear more from one of our panelists later about how that breakdown differs for specific ethnic subgroups. For women overall, the wage gap is about 80 cents, meaning that women overall earn just 80 cents to every dollar earned by men. White women make about 80 cents as well. Black women earn 61 cents to the dollar, Native women 58 cents, and Latinas 53 cents. So this gives you a sense of kind of the spread of the wage gap that takes a toll on all women, but for women of color, it's particularly egregious. So we wanted to talk about what this means for women in their lives, and knowing that women are more often now either the co- or primary breadwinners in their families, these wage gap numbers take a toll not only on the women, but also on their families, on communities as a whole, and on the economy. So we brought some of these numbers up on the PowerPoint to show you what this translates into real life. The estimates for women overall of the wage gap and what it translates into: a yearly salary difference of over $10,000. It equals about $900 billion per year. This is for all women. And what that really means is that women could pay up to one additional year of college tuition and fees at a four-year college, 74 more weeks of food, there's a missing number, nearly 7 more months of mortgage and utility payments, and 14 months of childcare. So you really see that these wage gaps aren't just numbers, but they really do translate into real-world effects. So before we get on to our next slide, I just wanted to make a few more general kind of overview comments about analyses that show that the wage gap really does contribute to the rising poverty rates in the United States, and that kind of grounds our conversation today about why we recognize these wage gaps for women overall, and then the broader wage gaps for women of color, given the effects that they have on families and the economy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maya Raghu to talk some about the drivers and contributors to the wage gap.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks for being here, everyone. So you'll see on your screen several drivers or causes of the gender wage gap, and I wanted to talk a little bit about them, and I might jump back and forth between them because they're actually all interconnected. We hear a lot from skeptics of the wage gap, people who don't believe that it exists, and they say that the wage gap only exists because of differences in women's education or because of the choices that women make, and that if you control for different factors, then there really is no gender wage gap at all. But we know from research that just 1 year after college graduation, women are paid 82% of what their similarly educated and experienced male peers are paid. So that wage gap, data is showing us, starts right out of college. In addition, we know from data and our analyses that wage gaps exist in nearly every occupation, whether women work in low-wage jobs like cashiers or in retail, whether they work in mid-wage jobs like travel agents, or whether they work in high-wage jobs like lawyers or physicians and surgeons. We also know from studies and data that even when you control for education, for race, for unionization, for work experience and occupation, it still leaves 38% of the wage gap unexplained. And discrimination is thought to be a major portion of that 38%. We know that women and women of color often face overt discrimination and unconscious bias and stereotypes in the workplace, all of which have an impact on pay. We know from the case law that there are cases where women were told they were being paid less than their male counterparts because the man had a family to support. Or even where the woman is married, she's sometimes told that her husband is the breadwinner and she's just working to make some extra money for shopping. Or for fun stuff. And that's things we've learned from the cases. There are also studies, there's an experiment in the science world where scientists were presented with identical resumes, one with the name John, one with the name Jennifer, and the scientists offered the male applicants a salary of nearly $4,000 more and judged him to be more competent and hireable. And we know that racial stereotypes also play into this. There are stereotypes about Black women being aggressive or being lazy, or Asian women who are quiet and who aren't going to cause problems and are submissive. And all of those also affect the way that we find women of color in particular overrepresented in low-wage jobs, underrepresented in higher paying jobs, and how that affects their ability to advance in the workplace and to be paid more. Also, the fact that women still shoulder the majority of caregiving responsibilities in this country plays a role in the gender wage gap, partly because of stereotypes, but it's also partly because of the way workplaces are structured and policies that workplaces still have in place that make it really hard for women to stay in a good paying job and to advance. So women are overrepresented in low wage jobs. A lot of times employers don't offer accommodations for pregnant workers. A lot of workers don't have access to paid leave or to paid sick days or affordable childcare. And all of these things make it very hard for women to manage work and their family responsibilities. In addition, there's still a lot of discrimination against people who are caregivers, especially mothers. As Jessica mentioned, increasing numbers of women and mothers in the workforce are the primary or sole breadwinners for their family. But mothers experience a wage gap. They only make 71 cents on the dollar compared to fathers. And that's a loss of $16,000 annually, which is a lot. And mothers still face a lot of stereotypes about their competence and their commitment to the job. In fact, there was a study about 10 years ago that showed when we were comparing equally qualified women candidates, women who were mothers were recommended for lower starting salaries, and they were perceived as less competent. Whereas fathers in the study, it was just the opposite situation. Fathers were recommended for significantly higher salaries, and they were seen as more committed to their jobs than men who were not fathers. Women who are caregivers, we find, are often steered by employers towards particular types of jobs, or they're passed over for opportunities for advancement or promotion based on stereotypes about their commitment to the job. So, for instance, a lot of times women with young children are not told about higher level positions with higher pay that require travel, because an employer assumes that a woman with young children would not want to be away from home or from work in a way that they wouldn't make those same assumptions about men. So all of those things, all of those forms of discrimination factor into the gender wage gap. In addition, pay secrecy compounds this problem. Pay discrimination is really hard to uncover and detect because there's a lot of secrecy around pay. It's a cultural issue, and also many employers have policies in place, whether they're written or they're spoken, that prevent employees from being able to talk to each other in the workplace about their pay and penalize them if they do so. So remember the case of Lily Ledbetter, who only discovered she was being paid less than her male counterparts at the Goodyear plant. And this is after she had worked there for 20 years because she was slipped an anonymous note. And pay discrimination tells us that many people find out about pay disparities by accident. Sometimes they see a paycheck left out there somewhere, there's a spreadsheet someone left on the copier, or for a lot of women, they are interviewing and hiring a man for a junior position and then find out that he's going to be making more than they are. Pay secrecy policies are quite widespread in the private sector. A study found that more than 60% of workers in the private sector are forbidden or strongly discouraged from talking about their pay with each other. And so this makes it really difficult for people to talk to each other about their pay and uncover the kinds of information they need to challenge discrimination. And it becomes a risk, right, to speak up and talk to others. So Jessica and I are going to later discuss trends in legislative reform, and one of them is to provide workers with protection from retaliation for discussing their pay with each other. And finally, I had mentioned earlier that women are overrepresented in low-wage jobs. So a big driver of the wage gap is occupational segregation. Women face significant barriers like harassment and discrimination to entering higher wage or non-traditional jobs for women, and that means they continue to be underrepresented in these higher-paying jobs. In addition, all too often, wages and occupations that are made up predominantly of women, so-called pink-collar occupations like childcare or family caregivers or servers, pay low wages. And that's in part because the work that is traditionally done by women is actually undervalued. And that's borne out by some research and data. So that is another driver of the wage gap. And finally, we hear a lot about how, well, if we just made women better negotiators, that would account for the wage gap as well. And that's not the sole answer to fixing the wage gap. Women are less likely to negotiate their salaries than men, but that's for some very good reasons. Studies show that employers react more favorably to men who negotiate salaries, whereas women who negotiate face some gendered stereotypes that they are seen as too aggressive or too greedy. And when they do negotiate, they are often less likely to receive the raises that they seek. So this sort of hostility and gendered stereotypes discourages a lot of women from negotiating. So, that's one thing to keep in mind as we go through this discussion.
Okay, so next we're going to turn to some of the trends that we are seeing in legislation at the state and federal level to try to address some of these contributors that Maya just laid out that we see contributing to the wage gaps. So we're going to start talking about the first bullet point, which is protection for talking about pay. And as you heard from Maya, one of the main contributors is that women and people of color often don't know that they are getting paid less than their counterparts for performing equal or substantially similar work, and often don't even know what other people are getting paid at all. Unfortunately, as you heard, many employers have explicit policies that prohibit employees from discussing pay, and or it's frowned upon in an employment for workers to discuss or ask about pay. So we're seeing some legislation that actually explicitly protects workers from retaliation when they ask about pay or disclose their own wages. One example of that is here in California. Our California State Equal Pay Act has been around for many years, but was amended in 2015 in many ways. And one of the amendments basically added an explicit protection against retaliation for discussing pay, disclosing one's wages, or asking about pay. There is some argument, and in some cases the argument has been made, that under the National Labor Relations Act, which protects workers, well, in addition to allowing workers to form unions, also protects workers who engage in concerted protected activity and take action, at least two people taking action to try to better their working conditions. And there's some argument that workers, at least two or more, would be protected if they were discussing pay, protected from retaliation under the NLRA. However, in California and in some other state legislatures, there are now explicit protections prohibiting retaliation by employers for those workers who do discuss pay. The second trend that we've seen is pay data collection. And I think this is an important piece to discuss at the state and federal level. And you'll also hear about how employers are affirmatively recognizing the use of collecting pay data to analyze whether there are disparities and then rectify those disparities. So you'll hear more about how employers affirmatively choose to do that. But we've also seen trends in legislation of legislators requiring employers to do that, or intending to require employers to do that. So under the Obama administration, the EEOC had enacted a rule change that would have required large employers of 100 or more employees to collect and report pay data, internal pay data, broken down by race, gender, and ethnicity, along with occupational divisions within their companies, such that they themselves might determine where there are pay disparities that they were unaware of, and then they would have to report that data to the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, our federal anti-discrimination enforcement agency, which would then help that agency with their affirmative enforcement efforts of our equal pay laws. That rule has been stalled at the federal level, and there is actually pending litigation around that stalling of that rule brought by National Women's Law Center, among others. So right now that rule is stalled, but we've seen some state legislatures trying to enact that type of pay data collection here to try to do it in their own states. So one example is here in California. There is a pending bill that would require California employers of 100 or more employees to collect this type of pay data broken down by race, gender, and ethnicity, report it to the California State Anti-Discrimination Enforcement Agency. And again, the idea is that this allows employers to uncover either pay disparities or also occupational segregation, which Maya discussed, whereby women and people of color are funneled into the lower paid positions within a company, and hopefully incentivize them not only to close those pay gaps that they determine exist if they need to be closed, but also to potentially make changes in hiring and promotion and pay practices to try to avoid these types of patterns of occupational segregation, which lead to broader pay disparities. And the last trend that I'm going to talk about is the use of salary history, and Maya discussed that as a contributor to the wage gap. We know it's a very common practice for employers to ask prospective employees about their pay, and so we've seen a trend in both state and local legislatures that either prohibits or limits employers from asking prospective employees about their prior pay or their current pay at their job that they're in when they apply for their job. And really, this kind of stops the perpetuation of the wage gap. When we know a wage gap exists, if employers are basing new pay offers on an employee's prior pay, then by nature they are going to be perpetuating that gap. And so we've seen this in a number of legislatures, not only prohibiting the asking about prior salary, but also then prohibiting employers from relying on that prior salary unless the prospective employee chooses to provide that information in the course of negotiations. So I'm going to take a pause right here before we continue with the discussion about trends in equal pay legislation to do a quick poll. So if you're not familiar with polls, this is for all of you who are watching the webinar to hopefully participate and engage. So I'm going to put a poll question up here, and the question that you should hopefully see is whether you have been asked about ever your current or former salary in the course of applying for a new job and or in the course of salary negotiations. So is anyone not seeing the poll question? And if for all the participants, we're just going to wait about 15 seconds to allow you to vote. Okay, so while we're waiting for a few more people to vote, we are seeing a very high number of yeses, which is not surprising to any of us who are working in equal pay issues. So right now we're at 85% yes, and I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds so that we can see the final results. Great. So the final percentage is 83% of participants in this webinar have been asked about their prior salary in the course of negotiations with a new employer or potential new employer. 17% said no. And so that is very consistent with what we've seen. I'm going to close that poll now. Okay. And hopefully you're seeing the slideshow again. So yes, we've seen this being a consistent practice, and we now see the importance of legislatures actually proactively addressing this to prohibit employers from asking unless the employee so chooses. I'm going to turn it over to Maya now to continue with discussing the trends in legislation.
Thanks, Jessica. So one of the trends I wanted to talk about briefly is we have been talking today about the gender wage gap, but we know that working people also experience discrimination in pay based on their race or disability or other characteristics. And we saw from the data that Jess talked about at the beginning of the webinar that women of color in particular experience much more dramatic wage gaps than women overall compared to men overall. So the problem is the federal Equal Pay Act and many state equal pay laws right now are just focused on pay disparities based on sex. So one of the things that we've seen in the last few years at the state level is states strengthening their equal pay laws and trying to close wage gaps by extending their equal pay laws to characteristics other than sex. So for example, in New Jersey and Washington State, they amended their equal pay laws to extend those protections to all protected classes under the law. So not just race or sex, but national origin, age, marital status, and things like that. And California also extended its equal pay law to include race and ethnicity, for example. Other trends that we're seeing have to do with the way that workers who want to challenge pay discrimination can prove their case. So under the Federal Equal Pay Act and many state equal pay laws, you have to show that you're not being, the standard is equal pay for equal work, right? And equal work doesn't mean an identical job, but it means substantially equal. And courts have interpreted this in a way that's very narrow and has made it very, very hard for workers to show that they were doing substantially equal work to their male comparators. Courts are looking at a mix of factors like skill, effort, responsibility that's performed under similar working conditions. But they're basically saying you have to have almost the exact same skills or effort or responsibility required by the job in order to show, meet your case under the law. So what we have seen in the states is moving towards a broader standard so that people's cases aren't thrown out at the first step. So again, in states like New Jersey or Oregon, we're seeing states moving to a broader standard like substantially similar work or comparable work which gives workers a fairer shot at being able to prove a case of pay discrimination. Another big issue, both at the federal and state level, has to do with defenses that employers can assert under the law to justify any sort of pay disparity. So both in the Federal Equal Pay Act and in state equal pay laws, once a worker makes her case showing that she's being paid differently than her male counterpart, the employer has the opportunity to assert some defenses to justify that disparity, right? So it can be based on things like seniority or a merit system. Under the Federal Equal Pay Act, there are 4 defenses, and one of them is a factor other than sex. So the issue is that over the years, courts have interpreted this defense so broadly that they have let employers make pretty much any justification for a pay disparity by saying, well, it's not based on sex, so I can do this, and it's justified. So for example, using someone's prior salary to set their current salary in a new job, or saying that any pay disparity is the result of the male candidate's stronger negotiating abilities, or that it's market forces, that you had to pay the male candidate more to lure him away from his old job. All of these, some courts have accepted without really scrutinizing the employer's justifications. So what some states have done and what the federal Paycheck Fairness Act, which is pending in Congress right now, would do is to narrow and try to close that loophole by requiring employers to provide additional information to justify that pay disparity. So for example, that it's, actually based on a business reason, that it's related to job performance, consistent with business necessity, and it accounts for the entire pay differential. And finally, the last one, can you go back a slide, please? Thanks. Is increasing available relief and damages available to plaintiffs. So under the Federal Equal Pay Act and any state laws, right now the only damages that are available are 2 years of back pay and sometimes an amount in liquidated damages, but not compensatory damages or punitive damages. So what some states have done is to change that to allow access to more types of damages and more relief so that plaintiffs can be made whole for the harm that they've experienced as a result of the discrimination. And also, allowing for larger penalties creates more of an incentive for employers to do some of that work and be proactive to identify pay disparities and pay discrimination and to fix them before there's a lawsuit. So this helps, and the idea is to incentivize employers to be proactive about addressing discrimination. And I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Maya. So this last slide, we just wanted to kind of summarize the Paycheck Fairness Act, which is now pending at the federal level, basically does a lot of the things that Maya and I have spoken about in terms of legislative trends that we've seen at the state level to try to address the gaps in equal pay law and some of the contributors that we've mentioned today. So there's more information about this will be provided through the materials of the webinar. And next, I'm going to turn it over to Sang-Yan Choi Maro, who is the Executive Director of Napa, and she will be discussing specific issues within the AAPI community with regard to equal pay. So take it away, Sang-Yan.
Thank you. So just a little bit about NAPAF. We are the nation's only national organization that is committed to building power with AAPI women and girls in our communities to create the changes that we want to see to improve our lives and to create a world where we can all thrive. And so we work on public policy in conjunction with community organizing on the ground, and we focus on reproductive rights and health, immigrant rights, as well as economic justice. So that's sort of our broad frame. And we are especially interested in working on equal pay to really expand the narrative about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and dispelling some of the stereotypes there are about who we are. And so as you can see, even in equal pay, you can say, oh, look, the Asians are doing better than everybody else. Their equal pay day comes first on March 5th. But there is always more to the story. And so that's what I will be delving into a little bit here on this panel today. So just to bring to your attention, NAPHOF will be hosting and leading and coordinating with other organizations to do a bunch of social media because tomorrow for Equal Pay Day, because our main goal is to really do more public education around some of the things that I will be talking about with you here on this call. So if you're on Twitter, if you're on Facebook, join us, retweet us, share our stuff so more people can learn more about the truth behind Equal Pay Day for Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls. So on to the next slide, just before we get started, like talking about the data itself, I wanted to also share that during the general elections in the last general elections, exit polling showed that 89% of Asian Americans who voted agree that employers should pay men and women equally for their equal work. So there's clearly a huge support for equal pay in the AAPI community, as well as seeing the need for it. People are, whether it's personal to them or they know people who experience it, it's clearly an issue that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders care about. So as mentioned earlier, onto the next slide, please, thank you. For every dollar an average white man made in 2017, Asian American women made only 85 cents. That should say 2018. Apologize for that typo. But as we said, the national average is 80 cents for all women, and here we are, Asian Americans are making 5 cents more than everybody else. But if when we disaggregate the data, that's when we look at different ethnic groups in their, within their ethnic groups, the gap is much greater. And so the reason why this number shows up so high is because also of our population, right? Asian Americans are still the smallest racial group in America. And so when you aggregate data of a very small set of people, the numbers get really skewed. So as you can see on the slide right now, the gap within the range of gap that's experienced by AAPI women and girls is huge, right? We go everywhere from making probably the most, right? Like we make more, some of us in the API community on average make more than what a white man made in 1 year, to all the way to half of what a white man made. And just for your reference, if we look, referencing back to the earlier slide that Jessica talked about, where it showed the different racial breakdown, on there, the folks with the widest gap were Latinas at 53 cents to a white man's dollar. And you look at our equal pay disaggregated data, you see Burmese Americans actually below that. So we go from having the smallest gap or no gap to the widest gap in one community. And so the reason why this is so important to note, and this is one of the graphs that we use the most on Equal Pay Day, because we feel like saying March 5th is AAPI Equal Pay Day doesn't really paint the full picture and doesn't tell the whole narrative of the varied experiences that Asian Americans experience. And what's so interesting is when I talk to legislators about this, depending on their district and who the AAPI population that live in their district, their guesses on when AAPI Equal Pay Day falls varies, right? So I was talking to somebody, a member of Congress who represents a part of Boston, where there is a large population of recent Chinese immigrants that tend to be mostly in service sector, and she guessed that our Equal Pay Day would fall in September. So when I told her our Equal Pay Day is actually in March, she was really surprised. And that just goes to show that there is a range, right? That not all Asian Americans are engineers and lawyers and doctors, and not all of us are making more than everybody else. And in fact, that this is equal pay day education is one of the things we do to really dispel this model minority myth that, Asian Americans are the model minority, that we, work hard and we make American dreams come true and, make more than everybody else. As you can see that there is diversity in income in our community, as shown in this graph. And just to say a little bit about background information, you could be like, wow, why are Indians making so much more than Laotians and Burmese? Some of this is also the data that shows up in terms of population, right? So in the United States, the top 3 largest Asian American ethnic groups are Chinese, Filipino, and Indians. And so when you have Indian Americans at the highest bracket in the wage gap or with no wage gap and being one of the largest population, it will throw off the averages, right? Because if you put in more Indian Americans into the mix than Burmese Americans, in fact, there is 300 times more Indian Americans than there are Burmese Americans, the numbers get completely skewed, right? And so one of the things that is really important is to not lump Asian Americans into one monolith, because we are not, and that we all have different experiences. And I think this is a part where, to me, it's really important that wage gap isn't only created by discriminatory practices by employers or by gender stereotypes or even racial stereotypes. Those are all true, but it is also by, access to education, history of your family. As you can see, some of the folks that are on the widest wage gap in the API community come as refugees to the United States, right? Burmese, Hmong, Laotians, Cambodians have all started their time in the United States as refugees. And what we often find is very similar in other sectors, like in education and funding for education, that because the AAPI data gets aggregated, they're like, oh, Asian Americans' high school graduation rate is so high, we don't need to worry about the AAPI community. When actually, if you disaggregate the data, that is not true. And so one of the things that, I think can really help is to advocate for disaggregation of data of AAPIs, which is actually very expensive because there's so few of us that if you want to actually be able to disaggregate and say how many Indian Americans, how many Laotian Americans, how many Burmese Americans feel this way or experience this, you have to oversample, and that's what costs a lot of money, and data is hard to come by. And so that's one of the things that NAPAF advocates for, right? Is that we advocate for government funding more disaggregated data and oversampling of our communities. We also advocate for that to research organizations when they do their research, that we ask them to oversample the API community so we can get disaggregated data. Because as you can see, we don't tell one story. There's no one story of Asian Americans. And in fact, the Asian American story, you could argue, is the most diverse collection of stories in terms of a racial group. So I wanted to just leave you with this graph, and I hope, you save it or, maybe tweet us tomorrow, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and you can get this graph tomorrow. But I think it is really important for those of us, especially in the Asian American community, as we talk about equal pay, that we're not only talking about the pay disparity in terms of gender gap, but also within our community as a racial and ethnic gap as well. And that some of those are really derived from the historical context of our communities and how our migration stories and the opportunities we've been given or not been given or had access to as we settled in the United States as immigrants. And so I hope this was helpful to you all. Hopefully there'll be time for questions at the end, but just wanted to leave you with the thought that there's always more to the story in the API community, and that's definitely true of AAPI Equal Pay Day.
Thank you. Next, we have now gone through the contributors to the overall wage gap, the specific issues within the AAPI women's community. And we now, as Maya and I know, we work a lot on legislation, state and federal legislation to address these gaps. But we also know that some employers are taking steps to proactively address the wage gap, determine whether there are gaps in their company, and take steps to rectify those gaps, but also to take affirmative steps to ensure better diversity and equity within their companies. And one of those companies is Salesforce. There's been some news around it. So we're really happy today to have Sue-Ham Walker. She is the Vice President and Associate General Counsel for Global Labor and Employment at Salesforce, and she's going to talk about some of these proactive measures that companies can take to try to address some of these issues. So thank you, Sue, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for including us in this very important topic and webinar. We're excited to be part of this group. Let me just step back for a second before we get into our equal pay journey. Just give a quick summary about who Salesforce is, a little bit, and then we can talk about our particular journey with pay equity. So we're an enterprise software company headquartered here in San Francisco. We're located in 27 countries, so we're a multinational corporation, currently at around 36,000 employees, but growing explosively. And we've always had equality as a core value. I think in the past several years, we've seen it really move up in terms of the company priorities, explicitly being stated as one of our values that we all organize our yearly and long-term goals around. We have, for example, a Chief Equality Officer who joined us about 2 years ago, and we've taken leading stances in the U.S. and elsewhere on equality legislation. For example, in Indiana several years ago, we rallied our government affairs and legal teams to stand up against legislation at the time that was being considered by then Governor Pence around the ability for businesses to deny services to certain groups of people based on their own values and religious beliefs. So this notion of being an active participant in our communities in which we serve and live has been embedded in our DNA from the core. So it'll probably come as no surprise then that pay equity is something that we also took a leading stance on, although it was a bit scary. I mean, we're all lawyers on this call, so it was a little bit scary to kind of dive in when people weren't really talking about it. So I'm here to talk to you about what that looks like, what we've learned from it, and sort of how we went about it. So if you can advance to the next slide, Jessica. Whoops. Okay, great. So we're gonna, and then you can actually, so we'll go through our pay equity story, the best practices, and some things that we learned from it. So we'll start with our pay equity journey. About 3 years ago, we made a commitment to ensure equal pay for equal work. We were, as recently as last year, profiled in a really big way in 60 Minutes regarding our efforts, our leading efforts around pay equity. And I encourage all of you to take a look at that story. At that time, we've since then, we've done 3 global pay equity assessments, and to date, we've spent upwards of about $9 million just any sort of unexplained differences in pay between men and women, as well as race and ethnicity in the U.S. And just so you know, this is a global pay equity analysis, not just focused on the U.S. We continue to focus on equality, diversity, and inclusion at all levels, and we review employee compensation on an ongoing basis. So one of the things that I'll point out, and actually if you could go to the next slide, one of the things that I'll point out from the 60 Minutes story is that the key message we gave as part of that story is that it's really critical for any company who's about to embark on something like this to get executive alignment and commitment at the top. You won't know what your pay equity analysis is going to reveal, and the last thing you want is to not do anything with it. So the first thing we did was to work with our executive team. We went straight to the top, and you'll see that our CEO, Mark Benioff, spoke in that 60 Minutes story, and he explained the story of how our chief people officer came to him and proposed this idea. And he's like, sure, no problem, but we shouldn't have a problem. And, you know, she was really insistent on, we don't know what we're going to find, but what I need is your commitment to, you know, open the hood of the car make sure that when whatever we see under there, it may be ugly, but we can't just shut the hood and just move on and pretend like we never saw it. So that's the first thing that we learned, and I think stood us in good stead from the very, very beginning, is that we had the right tone from the top from the very beginning. The second point is to commit to do something with analysis along those lines. Again, like I said, you don't know what you're going to find, and in the story you'll hear Mark Benioff say, "But we don't have a problem," and that's impossible. We've been a company that's grown up around our equality core value for a long time, so that's just not something that's going to happen. But as you can see, over 3 years, we've spent upwards of $9 million trying to correct that problem. So that's something that that's critical to make sure that your executive team understands, is that there may be something there despite your best efforts and your assumptions about what's there. In terms of the next steps then is, okay, so you have this commitment, you have the attention of your executive team. What do? It's, all I can say is it takes a village. At least for us, we have had tremendous success assembling a cross-functional team, and we've also, we're lucky to have a team of experts that we lean on to ensure that we're getting this done correctly. And so if you're a small company, you might not have all these different specialists, but for us, it looks like government affairs, public relations, we have internal employee communications, we have our data analysts, we have legal, of course, we have outside consultants, and you have your executive team. So next step, then you figure out, is this something you want to do in-house or outsource? At the time, there weren't a lot of outsourced solutions. This has become sort of a big focus and topic for boards and other companies. So we're seeing more and more third-party vendor solutions. Many of them are actually surprisingly good, so I would encourage you to look at them. Definitely look at the science behind how they're doing their analyses, look at the sort of full suite of packages, services that they provide to you. For us at the time, we decided we were going to do it in-house, and we were going to do it with close consultation with legal and some labor economists as well. Which leads us to the next question of attorney-client privilege. It's a question not every company comes out on the same side of, but I think for the vast majority of companies who do undertake this analysis, many of them do it under attorney-client privilege. Many of the things that we report out publicly obviously won't be privileged, but the core model and how we do the algorithms and the groupings and things like that are something that you're going to want to consider as protecting under attorney-client privilege, and be very mindful at the very outset of how you set that up and the steps that you want to take to ensure that you're protecting the privilege all along. Execution. So you're going to go through the model, you're going to figure out how you're going to slice the data, and then what are you going to do with it? There's a lot of things you need to consider, such as timing. When do you want to execute? What makes sense for when do you want to do this analysis? How do you want to couple that with other sort of big pay events at the company? How do you want to communicate that? That's also another part of the execution is an internal and external communications plan, which is critical to make sure that you understand how you're placing yourself and setting up expectations for what's happening with respect to this analysis. We, as a company that was kind of sort of one of the first ones to be doing this on a global basis, we had the luxury of not having an employee base that was really really demanding this information. So we didn't have the pressures of trying to manage the communications around that at the same time as we were trying to set up this analysis. If you're a company that's being pushed or incentivized to do this from your employee base, it's a very different set of considerations. So I would definitely encourage all of you to reach out to your communications professionals to make sure you have the right messaging at the same time, and also not to distract you from the underlying work with the analysis. So I think that probably is the next couple of bullet points on this slide as well. The internal communication plan and the external communication plan, which again will all vary depending on the context in which you're doing this analysis. The last point I'll make on best practices is around special considerations for global companies. This is not just a U.S. issue. We're seeing more and more governments outside the U.S. try to tackle this pay gap problem through legislation and mandatory reporting. So, for example, in the UK, we had a pay gap reporting requirement that came into place last March. And in France, we're seeing 2 phases of reporting right now with a very different type of analysis. What I'll say about your global analyses and legislative solutions is that they all take very different approaches. I don't know that any one is better than the other, but they're all very different. So for multinational companies, you're going to have to take into consideration what's on the horizon, what's in place already, and how you want to tackle each of these different types of disclosure requirements, given the analysis that you're doing. So definitely something to work with your government affairs team with if you're so lucky to have such a team. Okay, so we can move to the next slide. As a result of this pay analysis, we had a lot of follow-on work, as you can imagine. Once you kind of take a look under the hood at your pay structure and you had certain assumptions going in, you come out of it with even a longer list of things that you might need to do. So, for example, it gets you really thinking about pay philosophy and pay architecture. You heard Maya speak earlier in the presentation about pay secrecy and pay transparency, which is the flip side of that. You know, how is our pay structured? How are our job codes and job architecture set up? Do we have a pay philosophy at all? Can we articulate what it is? And then figuring out how to cascade that message and philosophy down all the way down to your individual line managers who are managing, 1 or 2 or even more employees. How do you cascade that message, and how do you enable those people to have the right conversations around what our pay philosophy and pay architecture is? So we've had a lot of follow-on work as a result of doing this sort of pay analysis. The other consideration that you become aware of, and especially for a very fast-growing tech company like us, is the issue of salary compression. That basically the notion is that when you're constantly hiring and you're growing as quickly as Salesforce, you have this phenomenon where you're constantly chasing market pay. Market pay is increasing faster than internal pay. So. Which kind of explains also why we have yearly adjustments. So I find it sometimes skeptical when you see high growth companies say, we've achieved parity and there's nothing more, because if you're hiring and you're hiring tech talent, you're most likely going to have some sort of a pay gap that your internal pay isn't keeping up with. I think we talked a little bit about context, our employees demanding this. This is going to be really critical for how you approach your communications plan. Depending on how this search is coming, or this analysis is coming up. Salary history and starting pay tool. For us, one of the key things that we did was, the easiest thing that we did was when the first legislation came down around prohibiting questions around salary history, we eliminated that practice globally. And so, thank you, Jessica. The rationale around why salary history is prohibited in recruiting practices is a sound one, and so we just went ahead and adopted it worldwide. We're also developing a starting pay tool that actually is a little bit of a misnomer, but hopefully tries to address that sort of gap between market pay and internal pay and gives managers more real-time information about where the salary should hit when you're considering making an offer to a new hire. And other things that we're doing, just really quickly, I'll summarize, is just, it isn't just about starting pay. It isn't just about just an annual analysis. There's a whole lot of things you can be doing as a company to make sure that this pay gap is eliminated. So promotions, for example, just having something as basic as good hygiene around promotions, making sure that they're transparent, that the standards are uniform, that the guidelines are transparent, that there's like specific times during the year when it's happening, so there's not one-offs happening all throughout the year. Those things are things that we are really focused on, and making sure that we have the ability to make sure that women are being considered in a fair way as they're getting promoted. Other things that my fellow panelists alluded to as well is also looking at the challenges that working women and frankly working parents face. So we have all sorts of benefits that provide support for parents, not just women. So for example, we have 26 weeks of paid parental leave with 12 weeks of paid parental leave for secondary caregivers. We also have, as part of that, a gradual return to work program that allows parents to return to work 4 days a week for up to 4 weeks. And you know, where, like in San Francisco, we have we're lucky enough to have on-site childcare as well. And one of the other things I'll just say around just looking at all of the aspects of the problem is just making sure that we are looking at leadership opportunities, that we're being transparent about, and making sure that we have guidelines in place for all the different points of employment and the employee history, and to make sure that that we have opportunities, fair opportunities for everyone participating in those events. So I went a lot longer than I thought I was going to, but hopefully that leaves us just a little bit of time for questions.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Sue. And you know, we're really excited to be able to have this employer perspective from an employer that's affirmatively addressing these issues. We have a lot of different types of participants on this webinar, but I think that all of the presentation is useful, but particularly with respect to your presentation, Sue, for those people who work in HR and or are lawyers, you know, general counsel within a company or represent companies in other ways, I think these tools are valuable for them to know the types of steps that companies can take and to see that it's actually doable. And then for others who aren't necessarily working within a company in HR or legally, I think it's important for people to see what companies can do so that they can advocate either as employers or as consumers to push companies to take these kinds of steps and show them that these steps can work and that it is doable for a company to take them. And I wanted to just note, of course, there are companies that are smaller than Salesforce that may not have the same resources to do all of the things that Salesforce is doing and that Sue mentioned, but there are definitely ways for smaller companies to do some of these types of steps, to take some of these types of steps. And we at Equal Rights Advocates, and I believe at National Women's Law Center, and other advocacy organizations are happy to kind of provide the types of tools that companies of all sizes can implement to try to address not only equal pay, but also some of the other contributors to the wage gap, like childcare, caregiving, paid leave, and those types of benefits. So you don't have to be a big company to affirmatively take on these types of issues. So thank you for sharing that, Sue. I'm going to take a quick second to do one other poll. So again, for everyone who is watching the webinar right now, I'm going to share a poll with you, and then please, you should see on your screen, and then please vote so that we can get a sense of your views on this, and then we will move on to some questions. So the question is, have you ever discovered that you were being paid less than a counterpart at work of the opposite sex, race, or ethnicity? So it should be up now, and you should be able to vote now. So we'll just give you a few seconds to do that. Okay, so results are coming in, and it was about half and half. I'm going to give it about 5 more seconds and then give you all the final vote. So we have about 44% of people saying yes, they have discovered that they at one point were making less money than a counterpart of an opposite sex, race, or ethnicity, and about 56% said no. So that's interesting because there are, of course, people who were aware of it, but that does go to, I think, the lowish numbers to show that many people are not aware of the pay disparities that may exist within their companies. And it kind of supports the notion that we need to have better pay transparency so that people are made aware of gaps and also protections for workers to ask about and discuss pay. So I'm going to close that poll. And before we turn it over to the audience for questions, and we're actually right on time, I just had a few questions that I wanted to direct to the participants. And so the first question is, I'm going to send it to Maya to ask, what can people do who may not be working in the field of equal pay or may not be lawyers or advocates, but want to try to take steps to support equal pay in their communities?
Great, thanks, Jessica. So I have two things that I wanted to mention, and one actually follows what Sue was saying earlier, which is that, you know, April 2nd is Equal Pay Day, which is the day that is observing the wage gap between all women as measured against all men. And what we've seen over the last few years is that more and more companies are starting to observe that day and taking the opportunity to talk about what they are doing within their own workforces to promote equal pay and close the wage gap. So if you are a person who is looking to try to create change within your company or start a conversation on equal pay, I think that's a good opportunity to say to your company, oh, are we doing anything around Equal Pay Day? And you can use Salesforce as an example of a company that is taking proactive steps to address the issue, both in terms of the work that they're doing internally, but also their external communications. The second thing I was going to say is that you can urge your legislators to either support equal pay legislation or to introduce equal pay legislation on the issues that we've talked about today, including at the federal level, the Paycheck Fairness Act, which has been introduced in the House and the Senate. But we know that this work is, going on at the state and local levels, and states have actually been moving much more quickly than Congress to strengthen equal pay law.
Thank you, Maya. And I also wanted to ask you, Sung-Yan, the same question. I know you talked some about the activities tomorrow, but other steps that people can take and maybe a reminder about the activities tomorrow to support equal pay issues in their community.
Yeah, for sure. So we'll be online most of tomorrow, but there'll be I think it's called a Twitter storm. I'm sorry, I'm not 100% on top of all the social media language, but that's going to be at 2 p.m. Eastern. So I think that's when we're going to get a number of groups on to retweet and hopefully trend on Twitter for a little bit. That's always fun to just see all the activities. But I think the main takeaway that I would love for y'all to leave with is remembering that wage gap issue is not only going to get solved by just addressing pay gap through single issue legislation, right? We need to take into account what creates the kind of environments that lands people in certain jobs or certain sectors and doesn't allow them to move on to higher income yielding fields and the like. And as I mentioned in the API community, often, it does really follow the trends of where folks, people's historical context. And so I hope that as we do our good work to address pay equity through law and some great practices that Sue mentioned on this call, that we're also keeping in mind that we need to also keep in mind there are other issues associated with it, including, paid leave, that we are the only developed country in the world, or probably one of the fewest countries in the world that does not have paid leave policy as a law, as well as educational attainment and opportunities for everyone across race and gender.
Thank you. So we're going to turn it over to, this is all of our emails in case you should want to reach out to us. And we're going to turn it over to the audience now for Q&A. So as I mentioned at the beginning, if you have questions, you can type them into your question box, and then I am going to read out some of the questions and direct them as I can to panelists as appropriate. So the first question is whether there are numbers for Native women, pay gap numbers. And there are. I believe the most recent data for Native women is that compared to white non-Hispanic men, Native women earn just 57 cents to every dollar. And so that equal pay day is going to be much further later in the year. And Maya, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but the 57 cents is the most recent data that I have.
Yeah, so the Equal Pay Day for Native women usually falls later in the year, around September. And often in trying to analyze the data, we come up from some of the same problems that we have in the AAPI community, which is the fact that there's often not enough data, that the sample sizes and the Census Bureau data that we use are too small to do some of the analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. So the next question is whether there is a statute of limitations, a comprehensive statute of limitations for filing a lawsuit around equal pay, or is it dependent on the individual state legislation? So I can answer that. Each state that has an Equal Pay Act, its own Equal Pay Act, will have its own statute of limitations, i.e. deadline in which someone would have to file a lawsuit or take legal action under their state law. So you should check your state to see whether there is a state law on the books and then what the statute of limitations or filing deadline is. At the federal level, the Federal Equal Pay Act, the statute of limitations is generally 2 years from the date of the violation. It can be 3 years if the act was willful, if the equal pay violation was willful, and that's under the Federal Equal Pay Act. There can also be legal claims for wage gaps, for wage discrimination under anti-discrimination law. So at the federal level, that would be Title VII, and then many states have their own state parallel anti-discrimination laws. And so the statute of limitations at the federal level, where you have to actually do administrative exhaustions. You have to first file with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission before you can file in court. And that statute of limitations depends on the state you're in, even though it's federal law, and that's either 180 days or 300 days from the date of the violation. So you'll want to check which state you're in and which statute of limitation applies. Again, that's under the federal law, and then you would check to see if your state has any state anti-discrimination law as well. The next question was about the National Labor Relations Act and whether that might apply to employees discussing wages. And as I mentioned, you know, on the advocate side, the preference would be to have explicit legislation that specifically makes it illegal for employers to retaliate against employees for asking about wages, discussing wages, disclosing their pay. But there is an argument for states and localities where there is no explicit legislation that prohibits this type of retaliation. There is an argument that under the National Labor Relations Act, because of the because of the protection for workers who engage in concerted protected activity, that could provide a legal remedy for when 2 or more workers have been retaliated against for discussing or disclosing pay. Maya, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, but that would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, and I think, again, part of the reason for something like Paycheck Fairness Act and the anti-retaliation protection in it is because, one, you mentioned concerted action, so it's just one person saying something that they may not be protected, and two, only certain, you know, there's certain employees that are covered and certain employees that aren't. So over the years, the way the NLRA has been interpreted has actually carved out some employees from its protection. So not all workers would get that protection necessarily.
Great point. Thank you. So I'm seeing just some comments about the importance of on-site childcare. So thank you, Sue, for highlighting that Salesforce does provide that in San Francisco. There are some other companies that are that have publicly announced that they provide childcare. The one that I'm aware of is Patagonia, and there are some other big ones. So I think it's important, again, that we kind of highlight those companies that are taking these kinds of proactive steps to address equal pay, but also some of the contributors that we don't really think about as contributing to these pay gaps, to show other companies that this is possible. So there was a question about tomorrow. So again, tomorrow, March 5th, is AAPI Women's Equal Pay Day. We will be highlighting the overall wage gap that you've heard about for AAPI women, but also the much larger gaps for ethnic subgroups within that community. So the tweet storm is at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. If you have questions about how to participate in the tweet storm, you can email me. I'm going to put my email back up here, and we will send you all the information to participate in that tweet storm to support that and highlight these issues on Twitter and social media. Anything else you wanted to add, Maya or Sungyeon?
I was just going to say, did you want to say what the hashtags are for the tweet storm tomorrow? So
yes, so the hashtag, yes. You go, Maya, and I'll put the slide up.
It's hashtag AAPI equal pay and hashtag your model minority.
Thank you. I clearly did not remember them. Thank you, Maya. And it's up. It should be up on your PowerPoint as well. So we would love for you to retweet all of the tweets that will be going on tomorrow about that. Sungyeon, anything else that you wanted to add about the AAPI Day?
No.
Okay.
So I guess one fun thing to add is 2 years ago, we trended in New York and DC. I have no idea what these things mean, so don't ask what that means. But we trended in New York and DC, and the big highlight for my team was that Constance Wu retweeted us. So that's the goal tomorrow, to trend and get this word out far and wide into all of our communities.
Great, thank you. So we have time for one more question, and then we will conclude the webinar. So the last question is if any of the panelists have thoughts about the experiences of contractors and or the contingent worker population and how equal pay issues affect them and or how that workforce kind of contributes to the pay gap.
Mm-hmm.
So anyone want to take that one on? It's a juicy one.
I suppose what I'll say is, like start with, if you're a contractor or if you are representing contractors, start with their employer first. There's a lot that we've been able to set by way of example for our larger community of partners, vendors, customers, and we're encouraging everyone to take the same sort of stands on equality that we are with respect to pay especially. So that's what I would say about that, to affect the most immediate change in any event.
Yeah, one of the things that I would add that's related to that is often contract workers, part-time workers don't have access to the same sort of protections that the employer is extending to quote employees, or the kinds of supports in the workplace that full-time employees are getting. So for example, on-site childcare or access to employer provided health insurance plans or paid leave. So to think about extending those same supports and protections to contract workers or temporary workers, part-time workers as well.
Thank you, Maya. So we are now reaching the end of the webinar. I want to thank all of the panelists for your really helpful and insightful contributions to the webinar. We will be sending the follow-up materials to everyone who registered, including a recording of the webinar and additional materials about the events that are taking place tomorrow on AAPI Women's Equal Pay Day. I want to thank the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, specifically the ABA Rights of Women Committee for co-hosting this webinar. And if you want to join the section for Civil Rights and Social Justice, if you're a member of the ABA, you can reach out to us so that you can join that section and participate in webinars like this going forward. This is the first of several webinars that will be addressing issues of equal pay, so we will send you additional information about those. And thank you everyone very much for participating.
Thank you.